Now, along with genres, we have textual strategies. This is very important for interviewing. Normally, when people talk about interviewing, they're really talking about probing. If you try to elicit information, you probe. What is a probe? When you define what a probe is traditionally, it's a request for a particular kind of content. I'm asking something from you. I'm after particular kinds of information from you. I'm after content. So a probe is a question designed to elicit particular kinds of information. But in systemics, in the systemic functional linguistic world, a probe is a request for a particular kind of content structure. Okay? So I can ask, I'm going to put you on the spot, Troy. What did you do this morning? Try and edit that so that it's...
Woke up.
Woke up.
Had a shower.
Yep. Okay.
Work.
Didn't have breakfast?
No, brought it in.
There you go. I used knowledge of generic structure. I was expecting a set of events in time order, and an unexpected one was that, like me, he doesn't eat breakfast, right? So I know when breakfast ought to happen between the events that you just said. So clearly you're not doing that while you're, driving to work, for example. Hope not. All right. So, okay. So I'm using probing in this case to actually elicit what's called a factual recount, or actually a narrative recount. It's your story. And that's typically as far as it goes with interviewing, content probing. But in systemics, there's actually another two kinds of textual strategies you can use. Not just probing, but you can also realign and repair. And these are very useful. Sometimes, I don't know whether you've had experience of an interviewee that's wandered off topic. You need to bring them back onto the topic. Fabulous though that may be, it's not answering the particular question that you're after. This is what a realign does. It's a question that you issue designed to bring them back to the topic. Yeah, that's very interesting, but actually, yeah, what I was after was X. So you bring them back. Now, the beautiful thing about genre theory is it'll tell you where to do that in that structure. You wait for a particular structure. You can see there's an issue. It's this particular element. I need to provide more information about what I want, and then I can bring that person back to the topic at hand. Second thing is an outright fail. I can elicit a particular kind of information. I wait for a particular kind of structure to come back, and it leads to a failure. The manager just can't answer the question, right? This is referred to as a repair. So it works out that every generic structure will have probes, repairs, and realigns, which is in advance of really what traditional interviewing does. So an example of probing for us, this is by no means exhaustive, but in the context of operations management, for example, eliciting information about sequence, just as I did with Troy, determining the identity of particular elements. So if you're going to name something, what would you call it? So that kind of thing is really about getting a vocabulary together. Recovering expected competencies and behaviours of interactors. These are just three. I mean, I've got a big long list of them in the book. With realigns, what we're trying to do is actually try to get information out of a client, but we're doing that by using a knowledge of the genre structure to repair a situation, to realign, an interviewee back into a genre, and repairs are when we are actually trying to get a restart to the genre. So we can draw these graphically like this. It doesn't matter, you don't need to deal with these representations. Some people find it very helpful to be able to see the map, if you like, of the genre. So as I said, I'm not looking at any old genres or all genres. I'm looking at particular kinds of genres, which I think work well for organisations. And the particular genres I'm wanting to talk to you about are called canonical genres. These are ones which are sort of idealised. You find them everywhere because they're very useful. If you want to write a memo or do a report or recount something or write a narrative, you are involved in a canonical genre. And it works out that really these canonical genres are reusable communication patterns. We can reuse them, we can modify them, we can append them together, we can add them together. I've actually developed generic forms for training using combinations of canonical genres. It just works out to be very easy to do it. It's a kind of linguistic cultural capital. So it works out that these are so useful that, in fact, all of Australia's secondary education system has had its assessments, and therefore its, the design of its subjects, developed by educationalists who have a systemic background. And so each particular kind of level at school and each particular kind of discipline has specific kinds of genre associated with it. There's also a sort of political dimension to this. By teaching people about genres, we enable them access to our culture. So it's more than just simply a competence. It's not about competence, it's about access. If you don't know the generic forms for a particular discipline, you don't know that discipline. And that's really what's propelled a lot of these great educationalists with these systemic backgrounds to develop this kind of work in canonical genre. It works out that when we're talking about interviewing, we're talking about mature language users, adult language users, that we're really dealing with two specific kinds of families of canonical genres. Ones that are about organising facts, and the other is about organising stories. And you can see that really, you know, if you're after an operations management interview, you're after facts primarily. You're after how is the supply chain working? What does this practice involve? You know, how do people get through the organisation? You know, how does the organisation grow? These are all really about facts. But if you're a manager and you want to recount experience, you'll probably use a story. And there's a lot of work on the importance of story and narrative management. It's a way of reasoning as well as a way of encoding experience. And so I feel we need to be familiar with both. And as it turns out, literally there are only 12 structures you need to know. I'm going to show you 3 of them, all right? Because I don't have time to show you all 12. But believe me, if you buy the wonderful Elicitation Strategies book from IGI Global, you'll see all 12, all right? Available at only one website, you know, which I got the link for later, right? So it works out that within factual canonical genres, there are 2 classes of factual canonical genre. One is specifically oriented towards activities and actions. And so it's got a temporal order to it, right? Stuff starts and then stuff finishes, and there's some processing in the middle. So this is really the so-called factual activity structured canonical genres. Include, for example, factual recounts, procedures. Procedures are, of course, could be kind of generally useful for business process management, re-engineering, information systems development, would use procedures primarily. Explanations and explorations, which are slightly modified versions of these factual activity genre. Together we have some which are not propelled along a timeline, that do not involve eventness, but involve stateness, if you like. And these include things like descriptions, reports, expositions and discussions, which are not time ordered, but they may be idea ordered, right? So these are referred to as factual, non-activity structured canonical genres. And finally, the narratives. There's only really 4 of them. Isn't it amazing that every story ever told is going to get slotted into one of those 4, basically? So let's have a look at the narrative recount to start with. So if you look at the literature, you get a structure which looks like this. The reality is that, for the most part, the structures are simpler when we are listening to them. And typically the most important part is this event record. This is the set of time-ordered events that you're waiting to hear when you want a narrative recount. Okay. And here's a really famous one. I will not sing this to you because I love you all too much. But you might recognise it. Woke up, got out of bed, ran a comb across my head. Anybody sing? Don't. I drank a cup. Looking up, I noticed I was late. Found my coat, grabbed my hat, made the bus in seconds flat. I'm almost about to sing. No, I won't. And I won't do any more because then there's a sort of issues about, you know, language and stuff. Go listen to the song if you want to know about that. Yeah, and we're all swaying up the back. That's fantastic. Well, that involves 10 events. So certainly it exceeded the number that Troy did in his morning. So I was also engaged in a narrative recount, eliciting one with you. So this is a little story about how common these things are. They're just everywhere. Whenever there's communication, there's genres. Factual recounts, it's a slightly simpler structure, are similarly engaged in a sort of a record of events, but this is meant to be factual in nature or is being presented as such. Now, this is an example of, you know, a real transcript where we're looking at things which are difficult. When we put them down on paper, we go, gosh, that's complicated, you know, that's really complicated. But you can see that in fact, you know, here's an event, right? So we got a new employee who was a professionally trained expert in the software, and he said, you're missing a bit. This was a paid-for patch. Well, in the context of this interview, that makes complete sense. It is a record of an event, right? We got this professionally trained expert in. But it's hidden in a bunch of language. But when you're in the field, for you, it's easy to pick this out. When I write it down, it looks infinitely more complex than it actually is in reality. My view of interviewing is that you can use these canonical genres to actually listen for the staging. You can listen to see if there are things that are missing. You can elicit then subsequent carry on or follow on messages. We can't do this in real time because we can't transcribe in real time. And even if we did, we'd have to read the thing. And if we had to read the thing, we're not in real time anymore. So we have to develop these practices that are basically based around speech and listening. Here's a report. This looks more complex, but basically it's quite straightforward. We've got, when we ask for a report, we can have sort of staging that provides the purpose and introduces what's going to happen next in a report. And then we'll have either a report that's organised around parts. If I'm wanting to talk about how a car works, I'm going to organise things around parts. You know, the wheels connected to the axle, and you know the brakes are connected to the wheels as well. I don't know much about cars, but you see the point. That's a part-oriented report. Or I could talk more generally about types. So I could say, this person over here is an expert in management theory, this person over here is an expert in IS, and so on. We talk about types. We're not showing any structural relationship when we're talking about types, other than the fact that we want to describe them all together. All right. So here's an example of an actual interview transcript with a company over at our innovation campus who were asked a question by me. Can you explain some of the key organising principles of Regulation Works, which is a product that they created? And they say, well, Regulation Works is a commercial off-the-shelf solution for government agencies to manage regulation, compliance, enforcement and regulated industry. And then they go and tell me some of the things that's involved in the design of that system. Activities. An activity is a term that's given to a process or an event. An entity, something or someone that exists that may be involved in an activity. Or resources, a person or an asset involved in the processing of an activity, and so on. So they've organised, actually, their response according to a report of a type. It's types of things that are being reported on. So this seems to be a different way of looking at interviews. For an interviewer, you have to think about the structure of the message that you're asking for and use that as a way of getting access into the knowledge that the interviewee has. So it's based on a theory of communication, not on a presumption that you're getting information flowing from, the mouth of one person into the ear of another. The second thing is, of course, this resource is one that's shared, where both interviewers and interviewees have access to this. If they're enculturated social subjects, as we like to refer to them as, they'll have this full repertoire of canonical genres, 12 of them, right? And this goes to the ethics of interviewing. Here I'm using resources that I know someone who's a competent English speaker, somebody who's knowledgeable about their area in an organisation are going to have. I'm not talking about information asymmetry now, I'm talking about resources that are the same. An elicitation strategy refers to, if you look at the classics, an elicitation strategy is a manner of asking for information which is often covert. So it automatically has built into it this notion that you're doing this kind of secretly. So I want an ethics where we're all on equal ground, both the interviewer and interviewee are on equal ground, in the sense that we have a shared cultural competence. So how would I include this notion of canonical genre into interviewing? Well, the first thing I do is add an extra step to the process of planning the interviews. So the interview planning leads to a document called an interview protocol. It's literally a list of questions you're going to ask, right? And usually this involves who are you going to ask, what are you going to ask, boom, boom. The last phase should be how you're going to ask it. What probes you're going to use, what canonical genre you're going to use in order to ask the question. And that means the interview protocol is going to consist of a list of questions, content questions, and assign to each a particular kind of canonical genre. I believe for purposes of organisational interviewing, you're dealing with two genre families, the narrative genre family and the factual genre family. You're selecting from basically 12 canonical forms. So during the process of interviewing, how do you know which one to select? How do you know which one to assign to a question? That's actually straightforward, although the solution doesn't look straightforward. It's straightforward from my perspective because somebody else invented it. And what this is a particular kind of classification scheme called a system network, and it's used to show differences between things. Things that are clustered together in this are similar structurally to each other. You read this from left to right. So we start off here. This square bracket means or. So for factual genres, I've either got activity structured factual genres or I've got non-activity structured factual genres. And if I want to create a specific kind of factual, activity structured factual genre, I'll use a factual recount. It relates to the specific experience that somebody's having. If I want a generalized form, this is, I'm likely to work with procedures. In the general case, I do this, then I might do that, then I might do that. This is a procedure, right? But if I want to explain how something works, I'll use an explanation genre, which actually has particular stages as well. Or if I want to debate a series of positions, then I would use an exploration genre to do that. So these differences really, once you get to read these differences in bold, you can very quickly assign a canonical genre to a particular kind of question based on what you want. Is it a story or is it facts? If you're dealing with a manager, you're probably dealing with a set of states to be described. So you don't want things in time order. You'll use a non-activity structured factual genre to either describe what's happening, or if I want to report on something or explain something, I've got these options here. So figuring out what canonical genre I need if I'm dealing with factual information involves basically traversing this graph and making a selection. One and only one selection will do. Okay. Martin also did the same thing for narrative genres, thankfully. Well, they're a much smaller one because we've only got really 4 of them. Narrative genres start off this way. Got up, got out of bed, didn't have my breakfast, went to work, slaved away, which is Troy's life. Narrative recount, right? And that's a sort of an expectancy. A counter expectancy, something that's got a little bit of a twist to it, could be a narrative, a canonical genre, a story-based canonical genre that has an element of frustration in it. That's what a narrative is. Counter expectancy, if there's not an element of frustration, we might get an anecdote. So often a lot of management stories are arranged like this, as anecdotes. Or if there's a sense of judgment, another canonical genre is called an exemplum, an example. Typically it's got sort of a judgment component to it.